Hello, welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with Thomas Keneally, who is an Australian author and writer best known for his nonfiction novel Schindler's Ark, the story of Oskar Schindler's rescue of Jews during the Holocaust, which won the Booker Prize in 1982. Schindler's Ark was later adapted into Steven Spielberg's 1993 film Schindler's List, which won 7 Academy Awards, including for Best Picture. But Thomas has written a variety of novels, however, including his most recent publication, Fanatic Heart, which was published in November of 2022, and Towards Asmara in 1989, which will be the main focus of our conversation. I'm pleased to have Thomas Keneally on the channel. Welcome.
Well, I'm very honored to be on the channel, George.
Well, you're very well known in Australia and across the world for your novels and your writings, but in our correspondence, you previously mentioned your Irish ancestry, and I'd like to highlight that. Can we discuss your background and how you came to be in Australia?
Well, many of us ended up here as the immigrants, but some also ended up here as British prisoners, political prisoners. So the Eritreans appealed to that tradition of resistance in my own family, and not resistance for its own sake, but resistance to a tyrannous regime. The first time I went to Eritrea, and when I got interested in it the first time, it was at war with a tyrant. It had known tyrants, including the emperor and including his successor, whom I've just mentioned, Mengistu. And it seemed that the Eritreans were fighting as just a war as you could find. It would have been great if someone had settled it, but because it was killing a lot of Eritreans and Ethiopians, and particularly uninformed Ethiopian young people. But it struck me as that if anyone was carrying on a just war, it was Eritrea. And indeed, that's a view too of a much more hard-headed doctor. I used to be interested in Eritrea with Dr. Fred Hollows, whose lens facility still operates lenses in Asmara. And I remember when years ago, in 1987, we saw the sterilization plant in a rota in the mountains, dug into the mountains in containers, and fully equipped crews in sterile gear working to manufacture in surgical infusions, the liquids that go into you during anesthesia and when you're very ill. And he was so impressed that someone in Africa, without a lot of encouragement from anyone, was with gifts of old equipment from the Italians and the Swedes and so on, was producing surgical infusions. And he thought the Eritreans are going to be these can-do African people. They're going to be a beacon to people because they know how to break the ceiling and get into manufacturing that is sophisticated. And so he was very impressed by the Eritreans' resistance, although he was rather pacifist, Fred Hollows. And he was also also felt passionately that the Eritreans could easily receive training to look after their own people. He always felt whether it was Australian Aboriginal eye health, in which he was a champion, or whether it was Eritrean or Kashmiri or Nepali or South African I care, that the people should do it themselves. And so I can remember when he was still persuading the Eritrean medical system in its rebellion, he was persuading them to send out teams to work, trained teams to work on cataract blindness in particular. And he did that because he felt, well, we both came through Port Sudan the first time we went to Eritrea, and we thought, what a model aid operation it was. The international aid organizations told us that the wastage was of goods shipped to the Eritreans in the Sudan and to be distributed in the Eritrean area, that this was had the highest non-wastage of any aid in the world. The Eritrean Relief Association, whose representative in Australia I knew, Fessehaie Abraham, and they raised aid on the basis that none of it would be spent in corruption. So the amount that the Eritreans were able to deliver at night through the truck system, going into the Ethiopian highlands, having to shelter by day, and then getting to the various food distribution points throughout the country, was an extraordinary operation to behold, combined with the fact that in Port Sudan, too, there was a hospital for amputees and for the permanently injured. This was an extraordinary place too. And so Fred Hollow said, the Eritreans aren't tea leaves. By that he meant rhyming slang. Tea leaves, thieves. They are not thieves. They do, they do stuff for themselves. They would rather do it for themselves than get it as charity from the West. And they did seem a remarkable people. The morale amongst the fighters, even though so many must have been killed, was extraordinarily high. And the sense of purpose, every afternoon about 3 o'clock, those who could would listen to the BBC African service. And I remember one day there was a commentator on talking about Kenya and suggesting that perhaps a one-party system would do Eritrea, would do Africa. There are many examples of it kind of working, and it might work better than multi-party democracy. And the men I was with, who were all Eritrean fighters, we were in a bunker in Nakfa. They all said, that's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the full schmeal of democracy. Now, as you said earlier, I wrote Schindler's List, and you talk to Jews about their extended family, Jews of that generation, and it just doesn't exist, you know. They've lost dozens of family in that calamity, but so did the Eritreans in their war with Ethiopia, in that long war. And now the loss of Eritreans continues when they try to make it to the Western world. And wars that the West ignored, wars that the West could have done something for, wars that the West interfered in and sometimes made worse. Suddenly the people who flee those wars are no longer are not welcome in the West. They have to jump through all the hoops in our immigration systems. And this is appalling, that the Eritrean war that was let to run would end up causing such misery, and that the coming of freedom wouldn't produce a perfect system, and far from it, and that therefore Eritreans would be forced to become refugees and would still be dying. So for the Eritrean people, there are those who live, and that army of Eritreans, that host of Eritreans that were killed in the war. First woman I ever saw wounded in Eritrea was a woman, 19 years old, shot through the pelvis with a round of, I don't know whether it was an AK-47 but she was all shot up, and her existence was even in doubt. And you wonder if she survived that operation at Rota, and I hope she did. Where is she now in the great diaspora of Eritrea? I hope she's in Norway or Germany or somewhere running a high-class Eritrean restaurant. I hope she is, and that she has conquered her wound. But I fear she's not. I fear she's in a grave in the Eritrean highlands, in the Ethiopian highlands. And she just stands for me for all the people who were killed. Now, there was a woman, famous woman, who came across from the Ethiopian side of the lines after her village had been raided and shot up. And in the shooting up of her village, she lost 3 children. She's a woman in her 20s. She lost the baby in her lap, and her leg was not shot off, but her leg had later to be amputated. So she's a one-legged woman who has survived the loss of 3 children. I don't know how you do that and keep breathing. And then in 89, I met her again. I met her in 87. I met her in 89, living behind the lines in the direction of Nakfa, but not far behind the lines, in a settlement that was all made of bush and bamboo and so on. It even had a bush mosque with its own bamboo tower. In any case, she was going to have another child. And how you can't, that is tough. No guarantees of survival at all. And you're going to affirm life. You're going to bring another child into the world, despite the fact your first 3 were shot dead by the enemy. And I think of that woman a great deal too, and where she is now. Again, I hope she's living as a one-legged matriarch in the in that southern area of Eritrea. But the slaughter, the scale of injury was very high on both sides, and the inroads that were made against the population of civilians, of Eritrean civilians, were terrible too. And so I think of the Eritrean people as an improbably brave people who are chiefly the deceased. And yet you will come back from this, and if there's a just world, a lot of you will go back to Eritrea, and you will make Eritrea your Dallas or your Fort Worth or your Philadelphia. I'm amazed how many there are in Eritrea and in America, how many Eritreans and how many Ethiopians. Um, and of course, the Ethiopian people are remarkable people too. And I hate the idea that during the famine, Mengistu put them in collectivized farms, the last thing that needed to happen to them. And in any case, you Eritreans are a light of liberty to the Americans who have forgot some of the best lessons of liberty. And, I think you're going to have a great impact everywhere because of the fact that, like many immigrants, you put a emphasis on the education of children. And no Eritrean child is going to be allowed to attend American high school and just be what's the American word? A douchebag, just and this is going to make the Eritrean contribution to America and Australia and Germany and to the West generally of a very high order. And yet, of course, the Eritreans are tormented, continue to be tormented and anguished by what's happening to their country. And I was a freeloader just coming in and having a look, and I found that scary. That you couldn't send emails and so on, and that you couldn't let people know where you were. And it was the only journalistic job in which you could do that. When Fred was always determined to set up programs in Eritrea that would last. He always said, we've had enough of this great white man coming in and showing the Africans how to do things. We've got to do it, we've got to empower, since they have so much power and have already empowered themselves, the Eritreans. We're going to have to just set up a few nuances on top of what they do. There's no great white fathers. Great white fathers fly in for a month and then are gone for 3 years. And so the idea that the Eritreans were absolutely clever enough to design their own redemption is very strong, and it's going to come, but it's, I gave, during the War of 2000, I went to Eritrea. I gave a talk at the university at Asmara, and a lot of the old soldiers, not so old actually, whom I'd known during the war, were present for that talk. And I put to them the idea that representative democracy was a very, very imperfect system. They were very disgusted by the impact of lobbying on American politics. And the people should fight the lobbyists. But the lobby isn't everything, although it's many things in American politics, including the gun lobby, of course. And I think that despite its flaws, the democratic system stumbles towards the light. I hope it does, but I could tell you deficiencies in Australian democracy, and everyone who lives here knows about them. There's a terrible immigration system, particularly for boat people coming down through the archipelagos of Southeast Asia, down through Indonesia, from Thailand, Singapore. They punish boat arrivals basically by detaining them indefinitely. So that's a shame on us. But we do great things too. We're about to acknowledge the claim of Aboriginal Australia on its own land. After all, they've been here for 80,000 years. And so there is a straining towards the light, far more so here now than in America, far more so. The Americans find it easy, given their religion and their economic theories, that 1/5 of the population should be lost people, should be disadvantaged. And they are people whose position in society is messed up by politics, trade unions, and so on. In Australia, there's more that fifth that neoliberalism has cut out of the Western equation. We've got to get them back. We've got to give them education, equality of education, and so on. And those things we've been lucky. So I'm not boasting. There are many reasons not to boast, including our detention centers, but there is a groping towards the light, and a bigger belief in social democracy, a bigger belief that medicine is not a product, is not a business. It's primarily a human right. Education is not a business. It's primarily a human right. And America is, particularly the Republicans, have lost that belief and have tended to believe that everything should be free market, free unrestrained market. And if you let the unrestrained market go, it will make everyone wealthy. Well, it hasn't, because part of American wealth was to get manufacturing offshore. And the people who were disinherited, the Americans who were disinherited by the closing down of American manufacturers, they were not picked up by anything else. They were not picked up by the riches of the majority or any other industry. So no wonder they're disgruntled and alienated. And so America hasn't looked after its own, and it must do so. And I know there have been great American politicians like Ted Kennedy who believe these social democratic policies. And it's funny, most of Americans' allies have free medicine and they don't consider it bad for business. Most have free public school system. And when I was young in Australia, university education was free. Now, to Americans, that is abominable. It means we're Bush socialists. We're hillbilly socialists from the Southwest Pacific. But we tend to think of equality of opportunity not as something you buy, but as something society gives you. And the Eritreans seem very much on song with these beliefs, so that it looked as though it was going to be the most promising republic on earth. And I said two things to the people at University of, and one of them was cynical and one of them was true. It's up to the citizens. The right to vote is not the end of it. You are, the citizen is on a perpetual campaign too, to inform himself and to neutralize the impact of people who are paying to have an influence on politicians. And this is a fight that will never end in democracy, and that we have to keep up and keep informed enough to fight. Because at the end of the day, once every 4 years, they really, 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 really need our individual votes. And the lobbyist doesn't have a bigger vote than us. So I made that it was democracy was appallingly imperfect, had to be kept on being refined, had to be kept on being worked on. The position of women, for example, which has become a big issue here. The things that are in society to keep women in their place and out of power. And I know Eritrea had a lot of, it was before its time. The rebel Eritreans had the most advanced feminist doctrines I've ever encountered, and that my mate Fred Hollows had ever encountered. And you know, it was it is going to be a great country. It is going to be a great country. The story's not over. I also made, but the second thing I said in University of Asmara was that you get a new sort of aid, and whether that's good or not, it often looks after the people. The question a small country like Eritrea has is who will manage its resources? You know, will you bring in an American company that's so big it will tell the president what to do? And obviously, Assayas didn't want that sort of company. But do you bring in foreign co-investors to build plants quick, to develop things quickly and produce jobs for people? And or do you try to set themselves up aggressively yourself with and not a bad thing. I mean, this was the Eritreans made their own antibiotics. They didn't need to import, you know, well, they needed to import as much as they could get, actually, because of the damage that was done by the battleground. But there's the question always, if you're a small country, how do you manage your resources? We've got lots of gas, a liquid, you know, the gas that lights the ovens, not the gas that lights the cars. And natural gas, who should we let mine it if Australian companies can't do it all? And this is a question that Eritrea faced and was aware was a peril. But I said, if you do, say you enter into a good and trusting relationship with a foreign company, German, Swedish, and they put a lot of capital in and develop the thing quickly. So you've suddenly got industries that are employing Eritreans. How do you, if you do that, that's creative. And you do need that, we all in practice need that foreign investment. And to an extent, never living by it, always being wise about how much we give away. And we have not always been wise about that in Australia. The Conservative government gave all our natural gas because business is good for everyone, isn't it? And they kept none for the state, for Australia. And so now we're buying our own gas at world prices, at the most expensive prices you can get. And it comes out of our ocean and out of our land. And we should have retained power over a portion of that gas. So that was always there. That's just an example. Nothing ever works out quite perfectly. But I said, if you make these relationships, you're getting real money. You're not getting aid money in all the time. You're getting real money. You're not objects of pity. And from other mixed economies around the world. And I said, that's why you should have a multi-party democracy. Now, I know that Muslims and Christian Highlanders became brothers and sisters in the Eritrean Liberation Front. And religion was not a problem in the Eritrean People's Liberation Army, and so on, or it didn't seem to be. And therefore, how much influence you let the Saudis have and so on. We even have here, they're taking over an entire Gulf circuit. We say, how much influence do we want the Saudis to have in our country? And Asais was always concerned about that in the field. The 2 times I interviewed him, he always said, you know, the way other African nations were developed was not the way the Eritreans should go. They should be true partners in development. They should not be, it was a very promising thing to hear from him, because, you know, if you receive aid, as sometimes has to happen from an NGO, that's one thing, but the question is, how much say does the NGO want? And the other thing is, when can we look after ourselves? When can we look after our own famine? Amartya Sen, the third reason is Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winning Indian economist, said, as you know, no famine has happened in a liberal democracy. And after my last trip to Eritrea in 2000, I went out to far west Queensland in New South Wales, in Australia. And there was a town running on natural gas called Amanagilda. And it had strong resources of natural gas. But what was interesting, it was 1,500 miles into the desert. It's 1,500 miles from Brisbane, yet it had good roads. It had tarred roads. And the tragedy in the famine, that roads 300 miles from the capital were unnegotiable for trucks. And therefore the people along those roads starved, you know. But if you've got a liberal democracy, the people of Thargomindah, there's also a place called Thargomindah, people in Thargomindah go to their local member of parliament and say, we're not going to vote to you unless we've got the same communications equipment, the same roads as the people in Brisbane have. And so you never get a famine. You get malnutrition through capitalist abuse. You get, but you never get a full-blown famine in a representative democracy, because of the fact that the man has to be re-elected. So it's imperfect, but it creates from itself the infrastructure to prevent famine, the infrastructure that trucks can travel on and deliver food on. So they were 3 reasons I gave for government, a different level for representative democracy, as flawed as it is. a different, you can always poke fun at it, there's no question. And I poke fun at it regularly here. I haven't been put in prison yet, and now I'm getting too old. I'm 87 years old. I'm aware what now I'm 87, and I'm able to swim every day. I'm able to go walking. That these resources, which are, I'm the grandchild of an Irish peasant, of Irish peasants, and yet I live such a privileged life. It's the life everyone should be living. It's the life we should be trying to give to everyone. And yes, this Eritrean belief that the Eritreans can look after themselves, that was very powerful amongst the rebels and amongst in the rebel army, that is something that should be taken into your life as a nation.
So, Tom, who introduced you to Eritrea? I know Fred Hollows is an Australian ophthalmologist, well known amongst Eritrean people. Can you discuss talking with him about Eritrea and how you really got started with this whole journey?
Yes, there was a young former fighter called Fessehaie Abraham. And Fessehaie was the man who first got Fred to go. He walked into Fred's surgery and said, I've got eye problems, and we called this problem Dalek blindness. And Fred recognized the condition from the eyes of Aboriginal stockmen. We call cowboys stockmen, Aboriginal range riders and cattle drovers. And it's very, and Fred, of course, led a great crusade for Aboriginal eye health. And now all over Australia, in remote Australia, there are eye clinics run by the Aboriginals on that principle of Fred's, we can't be a missionary, we can't swan in and be the great person bringing the truth and then go home when it suits us. And the Eritreans are clever enough to do anything. And he'd seen that you had gone from the pastoral straight into the industrial, in producing your own antibiotics and other goods in that place, in that hospital in Eritrea. And so Fessehaie Abraham went to Fred with the eye condition. Fred said, where you come from, Dalek blindness, where in the hell is Dalek, the Dalek Islands, you know. And then Fred began to read the limited, one of the Eritrean tragedies was there was such limited coverage of what the Eritreans were living through. He began to read the limited coverage that was in the Western press and Western magazine and Western scholarship, and he became passionate to go there. Fred was the sort of bloke, the sort of man who was genuinely an activist. His first impulse was to act and to go all the way. Okay, if you've got to fly to Khartoum and get a truck to Port Sudan and another truck into the Eritrean highlands, well, let's do it. And so on that basis, Fred started to go. And because I was a well-known writer, Fessehaie suggested I might like to go. And I said, well, the only trouble is, Fessehaie, I'm a coward. And according to Fred, these people are the bravest on earth. So, but I eventually went. And I hope all the people I saw then that first time, 87, the next time was 89, the next time was when you voted for independence. What joy that there was in Asmara then, and in the little villages where you'd see the entirety of the village turned out in their most exuberant costumes, and of course the women ululating. And when the observers for the election arrived, they would put wheels of injera on our round loaves of injera on our windscreen. And that was a very exuberant and happy time, of course. And Isaias confessed himself anxious at that stage about the fact that the Saudis would want an Islamic party. They certainly fund an Islamic party, and that this could undermine the fraternity that had been put in place by the war. And that was the sort of concern that seemed to me to govern his slow advance into a more dictatorial style. The impulses were good, but the choices were dictatorial. And then, of course, the last time I was back was when the war was on in 2000. And I was very shocked to see, although I shouldn't have been, because the Eritreans are human beings with all the flaws of human. You have your flaws too. The Tigrayan refugees being shipped out of Asmara, and they were in a refugee camp like the ones the Eritreans used to occupy, and by then the war had become much better. The atmosphere had changed. It was as if the Eritreans, after 7 years, knew they were in for, boy, a tough fight for freedom and a tough fight for, against the administration. And the great journey to Libya and across the Mediterranean had begun. How fortunate were the ones that were accepted into the US. You must be able to persuade that US bureaucracy that you belong in America. You must have been very determined people. And but anyone speaking to most Eritreans could tell that they're almost a new kind of African. And this they will prove again and again. Almost an African to whom wings were given and then taken away, but they're waiting for the wings to go back on again.
And Tom,
and I'm not talking about angelic wings.
Right.
I'm talking about wings that'll span the world of scholarship, the world of business, the world of diplomacy, etc.
Well, you spent 3 months in Eritrea to prepare writing for your book Towards Asmara. What was the late 1980s like in war-torn Eritrea, and how was it like being in the field with the fighters?
It was extremely primitive. You could use that term in terms of telecommunications. The Eritreans themselves were the most modern people you could find, but the communications were old-fashioned and involved field telephones and so on. And so it was particularly in 87. I think the Eritrean cause was at a bit of a nadir then. You're holding on well in the highlands, lots of very strong morale, to this extent that I got sickness one day going up toward, well, it must have been my second visit, going up towards Keren, but this is what it was like. And I was put in a bunker with some Eritrean people who were filling in their day, members of the EPLF. What was the EPLF? Is that the correct acronym?
It is.
Yeah. And I had heat sickness. And when I came round, the medic who had given me some electrolytics to sip, for heat exhaustion, said to me, had a map up on the wall and wanted a lecture on Australian constitutional arrangements. Well, our constitution is a strange one in that it came from the British, who only wanted us to be a dominion. And then it was used in various ways by the Australian to become their own people. But I did my best to tell him about that. And there were kids there. The EPLF fighter was very much a scholar too. And that was remarkable. I thought the other side doesn't have a chance because the other side are conscripts. And these people are scholar warriors. But then you think of what bullets do to people, which I've seen in a number of places, and it's not pretty. They were, and a lot of those fighters are now quite possibly dead as a result of the great advance on a rota and on, but that business of the Eritreans being first aid, medics and educators at the one time, troops in reserve getting an education on constitutional issues. It blew my mind. They seemed the most self-improving, self-driven people I'd ever met anywhere. And they had the least grounds for it, because look out at that landscape and it looked like a desolation. Not so much for Australians, because the Rift Valley looks like parts of Central Australia. But, they made civilization in bunkers, and their political heights had never been higher. And so on that second trip, I was able to go to down to the coast to, oh my heaven, I've forgotten. Massawa, and that heavily bombed out city. I met a family living on the railway station there. When I shook the man's hand, I found it was prosthetic. It had fingernails and all, but it was prosthetic. And
yeah, well, your travels inspired you to write towards Asmara, but it was a fictionalized account of the struggle from your time being there. First of all, how did you come to decide that a fictional story about Eritrea would interest readers, and how much of your field experience influenced the storyline? How did you come up with the concept of the plot that ended up being in the book?
Yes, the plot was based on a raid of Asmara airport, the ultimate plot, but it was based on the Ethiopian pilot I'd met, who was a prisoner. It was based on the sort of guides I'd met in the protocol department. It was based on a wedding I went to in Nakfa between two fighters. It was, nothing went to waste. And I was very interested in this idea of famine being not an act of God, not something that God does to people, but something that politics does to people. This question of what sort of government you should have to put an end to famine. And self-government has always been essential to putting an end to famine, for the reason I told you, that there'll be a member for the remote places, and he or she will want the road to go there. So the road and the medical service, everything will go there. And if there is a shortage of something, relief will go to that area. It won't be conquered by a failure of infrastructure, as so many Eritreans and Ethiopians were let down by a failure of Mengistu's infrastructure. And so I was simply fascinated by all this. The Africans seem to be the people of East Africa seemed so intelligent, so engaged in the world. That's the other thing. They knew more about the world than most city dwellers in other parts of Africa, because they read everything they could, or had it read to them, or had it recounted to them, listened to the BBC News. They were citizens of the world, though the world didn't know it. And I never met anyone like them, nor had Fred Hollows. And they had to be written about. And what I thought would happen is that it would help make visible this fight that the world was ignoring. And it had no impact at all. The world just got round to ignoring it in a different sort of way. Because the Americans, as you know, wanted Eritrea subsumed back into Ethiopia, and then they could be its person. You know, the Soviets would leave out of their own incompetence, and the Americans would take over. And this cynical usage of Eritrea was terrible, but the world didn't take that much notice. However, many politicians did. It was a successful book with politicians. So that when, for example, we went to the referendum in 1993, I believe, I went straight from the set of Schindler's List and Spielberg to Addis and met my wife there, and we went in as observers. We were appointed as observers, and it was an ecstatic time, as I've said, and it seemed that everything good might come good for the Eritreans. So the idea they made it impossible, and Assayas made it impossible to lose interest. Even though I haven't been there for 18 years, I'm a bit nervous about going, because obviously I wanted and I've got no right to want anything in Eritrea. I wanted a different Eritrea than he was determined to deliver. And a lot of Eritreans wanted a different Eritrea too, and do to this day.
I think a lot of people would sympathize with that notion, Tom. And I would just want to add the fact that you emphasize Eritrea as an exceptional or an egalitarian society surrounded by major conflict. This obviously must have give you new purpose when writing. When you wrote the manuscript and you sent it for publication, I'm talking about towards Asmara, had the publishers heard about Eritrea and this concept of self-reliance and the goals that they
No. I wrote a piece, most importantly, for the New York Times color magazine. And the boy who edited it was very hard-headed, and he said, look, I've read these sorts of stories about the Vietnamese and so on, and that all went wrong. So this will will all go wrong. And we said, no, it's the goods. Fred and I said, this is we had no right to say it, no right to an opinion. Eritreans do, and Eritreans also live in places where they're allowed to take part in the political discourse. So it must mean that, there must be many Eritreans out there who are interested in the governance of, and the question of Tigray and Eritrea in this war that's still being settled, isn't it? It's yeah. I mean, at first sight, the Tigrayans were the old allies from the civil war, and a lot of the stories that came out of that invasion were like stories that came out of Eritrea, but sort of unsourced. You didn't feel them. The Westerner didn't feel them intimately in his viscera, This is the problem we humans have. Harari says we can only really understand 150 people, our own clan. We can only feel it, and we've only got enough emotional hardware to deal with 150 people. So some of us decide anyone who isn't connected to us amongst that 150, all those are a write-off. And then others, think, no, we're all brothers and sisters from mitochondrial Eve, who was nearly an Eritrean. Mitochondrial Eve, whose mitochondria are in the cells of humanity.
Right.
And therefore, you've got to the Eritrean who gets killed trying to get out of Sudan, out of Eritrea or Sudan, trying to get to Libya to catch a boat. He or she is as important as any one of your 150. They are in someone's 150 intimate people without whom your emotional world, your intellectual world can't operate. And so anyone who supported Eritrea, of course, and it would have happened to Fred had he lived, he was always teased about Eritrea. No, I've certainly been teased about Eritrea. It's sort of, in Western terms, going bad. Isn't it funny, no matter what crimes we commit, we never go bad, but states in Africa go bad. Anyhow, I don't know what to do about this, George, or what I should do, except, I am a convinced supporter of the Eritreans, and know that you are a remarkable people. And when I lived in America, after the book had been written, Ted Kennedy was very interested in the Eritreans. He was like an old-fashioned, I know he had terrible crimes on his slate, Chappaquiddick and all, but he saw the potential of the Eritrean revolution, and he was very open to talking about Eritrea. But as you know, if you're a Republican in America now, you say there are tons of malice and crypto communism in the Democrat Party. And if you're a Democrat, you say, how can we push forward with this impenetrable lump on the other side of the house? But I hope, for the sake of the Eritrean people, there's an Eritrean I know who lives on the northern beaches and goes swimming all the time. And she was a woman who got a thigh wound as a fighter, and she says she got osteomyelitis in it, so it keeps cracking open occasionally. And at that time, she has to go to hospital, in which case the doctor says, "My heaven, what happened to you?" And it's an old, unsanitary osteomyelitic wound from the war with Mengistu. And she, instead of considering herself a victim, she said to me, "It was great because it always opened up when I needed it. When I was talking in North Africa to the UN, it split open and I suddenly was this object of pity." And that she should so bravely negotiate her way in the new world, relying on an occasional opening of her wound, it's just an index to me of how tough you guys are, and how, I was hoping that Eritrea would become a cause. I was appalled that the West thought that it was a famine produced by bad luck, a drought. What bad luck? And still too much, I think, Western NGOs promote that idea. Oh, they've got this dreadful drought. That's bullshit. If this was a liberal democracy, it would not cause what it causes in, say, Somalia now. And I'm not, as I've made it clear, I'm not a great, I know liberal democracy has great limitations, and it requires a very active constituency, and the constituency has to make it again and again. That's why we call ourselves citizens instead of instead of mere members of the public. There are Americans who are trying to remake America for good and ill as we speak, and this citizen involvement is crucial to democracy. And in any case, you are the people who have the presence to make a new and just Saudi Arabia, in the sense that it's an Arabic nation, I know, and you're an African and you're separated by the Red Sea. But I mean a really great, viable state. And to be a great state, a fifth of you people don't have to be poor. Mm. To be a great state, a fifth of you people have to have equality of opportunity, just in case there's a woman in there who won't let her children fail.
Well, Tom, and I'm really amazed by the recount that you had of not only the struggle, but what impact it had on you. And when you wrote the book, Towards Asmara, you gave it an interesting subtitle, A Novel for Africa. Perhaps you've alluded to this already, but why did you choose that subtitle in particular? And what does the setting in your novel represent, not only for the main characters, but for the readers who may not have heard before about the struggle of Eritrea's independence?
And there was no guarantee then, of course, in 1989, I think it came out, that the Eritreans were going to win. But it was looking better. Keren was no longer the front line. First time I went, Nakfa was the front line. Second time I went, Keren had been captured. So it was beginning to fall into place. Yes, I was hoping that you get ambitious ideas as a writer, and you think why couldn't I write something like The Sun Also Rises, or Hemingway's novel about the civil war in Spain, which is not The Sun Also Rises, but forgive me, I'm going to claim my age and my forgetfulness. But to make the justness, to make it to make the conflict so well known that a settlement would occur, a just settlement with all the and the Eritreans would have the chance to be fully themselves, to take their creativity out of the field and address it to politics and scholarship and development and all the rest of it. And that's what I was hoping. It didn't quite work out, but all the as I don't know if I mentioned, all the observers at the election were required to read it. The UN observers at the independence election were required to read it. And I thought that is great, because the best thing to do with a book is to influence those who have influence.
And it provides context.
If it's a political subject.
Absolutely.
And if you can get to Ted Kennedy and you don't get to millions, well, at least it got to Ted Kennedy.
Absolutely.
It got to just people in other bodies and just people in Eritrea. And I was very honored that the Eritreans, in plot, it's rather melodramatic. And I was very honored that the Eritreans would use it as an self-advertising tome. They give it to American politicians. They give it to politicians all over the world. And this was wonderful to me. I was very honored to have that position as a book in the Eritrean canon.
Well, it's a significant contribution to the legacy of Eritrea as a nation today. And it's important to record this history and to keep it as an archive for future generations to understand what the struggle was like. I was not alive in 1987 or in 1993. Yes. So it's, I think, very valuable to have that sort of recount of the struggle through written history, which unfortunately is not a trend across Africa, yes. to keep it.
There was an academic at UCLA who was an Australian too. So we began to fancy or having an Australian influence. You know, generally it's the Americans who have influence. And we were thinking we'd like to have an influence, to be able to say this is who these people were. And as I speak to you, I think another book on all this is due, maybe about the diaspora. But now, my people, the Irish, went to America a great deal. In America, they had freedom from British law. You know, Australia and Canada remained part of the empire. So we had certain constraints on us. And mind you, we got all the prisoners. We got all the political prisoners in Australia. Yippee. My great-grandfather was a Fenian Irishman transported on the last convict ship to Australia. So we got the good stuff in our genes, the rebel stuff. But I'd never seen rebels or read about rebels like you folks.
Well, Towards Asmara was promoted by then Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke, and it received critical acclaim in Australia, especially from the Eritrean community who had come at the time. What impact did writing the book have on you as an individual? How was it received by the Australian public and by the broader community of readers who purchased the novel?
Well, again, it was received with cries by those who read it of, we didn't know any of this. How astounding. This sounds like a fairy story, that there should be a rebel group that fights a battle, but also has troops in advance of the army in groups, but above all, that does all this, education and social social justice training and so on, as the Eritreans did. The Eritrean women may have been suffered in childhood traditional therapies to do with gynecology and so on, but they were fully modern women. It was as if they had stepped into the EPLF and stepped into their dignity instead of the other way round, stepping into the army and being subject to continual abuse. I'm sure some of that went on, but they just seemed so thoroughly motivated, and people felt that how could they be so thoroughly motivated on such scraps of resources as they had, scraps of leather from tires, scraps, abandoned bottles and tubing, maxillofacial equipment that the Germans had given away 50 years ago. Everything either improvised or out of date. This was the claim that the novel made for the Eritreans, and therefore the reaction, when there was a reaction, was astonishment. And certainly in Australia and in parts of America, an interest in the Eritreans increased. Now, why Bob Hawke was interested in it, an Australian Prime Minister, is that this was a very popular cause in Australia at that period of history. More recently, Conservatives have dragged Australia's interest back totally into the Pacific. The idea that Western Australia shares the Indian Ocean with Africa is not stressed. But in those days, there were a number of politicians who knew Fessehaie, the head of the Eritrean Relief in Australia, who knew of the efficiency of the Eritrean Relief Society's distribution of aid, who knew that there was a war going on at a time when Mengistu denied there was, and who knew that Mengistu was scandalously acquiring Russian weaponry at a time when the famine was on. And so the Australian politicians, because of Fred Hollows and because of the book, took up this proposition. And Fred Hollows could really compel politicians in a way I can't. But if he were here now, he'd be swearing about me and what a soft sister I am, except he couldn't use that term because it's a sexist term now. But that didn't hold him up for a moment at the time. And he would have accused me of being a weak person for not having spread the Eritrean message it is my belief that had Fred lived, he would have influenced Australian politics. Politicians could not ignore him. Even on his deathbed, both sides of politics had to promise that we would build that facility in Asmara for the Eritreans to use. But when I went to Eritrea in 2000, when I heard that that facility might be endangered if the Eritreans, if the Ethiopians invaded Asmara itself, I let the foreign minister know that I was going. And I was going to say, if I was in the position to say, you can't throw your grenades in here, go away, this belongs to the Australian people. It doesn't, it belongs to the Eritrean people. But the Australian people put up the cash to build this, and the Eritreans have honored it by running it all this time. And you want to chuck grenades into it? What sort of African are you, you little sod? Anyhow, I wanted to do that in Asmara if ever Fred's facility fell. And I saw much such machinery destroyed in other parts of Eritrea. The Eritreans had just built a new cotton gin processing plant out in Fessehaie near the Sudanese border. And we flew out there one day at very low altitude, and we saw all these wrecked villages, where former houses were smudges. They were as if a huge finger dipped in ink had descended on the landscape and done to every habitation, ground every habitation back into the texture of the page. And when we landed at Fessehaie, which was an Eritrean victory, the Ethiopian army had held it, but they hadn't been able to get tanks into it. But they had destroyed cotton machinery and generators with grenades, just gone around and dropped grenades into their intestines, basically, and blown them up. And I did think this would have happened in Asmara had it been captured. It would have happened to everything sophisticated. And it's sad that African wars deprive Africans of any sophistication that they have. If a particular group has a sophisticated bit of equipment, we'll blow the hell out of that. And that is one of the tragedies. And at that stage, though the attitudes were not quite as fraternal as they'd been in the field, even when the Eritreans were surviving, on a length of grass, on a slip of tire rubber. There was great hope and great morale. It's funny, there wasn't great morale in that war in 2000, although thank God the Ethiopian army never got to Arota and never got to Massawa and never got to Asmara either. And so, yes, I feel I've witnessed an extraordinary phenomenon. Now, back in the history of humankind, there was a random spark of DNA in our brains, and we became better at poetry, better at religion, we could make up myths, and better at mythology, more creative in our scientific, philosophic, literary imagination, and so on. And this huge advance in Homo sapiens, which happened sometime in the last 100,000 years, was a bit of random stuff that had elevated us a bit above our barbarousness. We were still barbarians, but we're also poets. Now, I was almost tempted to think that you Eritreans, in the furnace of that civil war, were evolving into a new kind of rational human being. That's the effect you had on people. And I didn't only think it, but Swedish people thought it, French, that remarkable exemplar of democracy and of dignity that existed in the EPLF and was maintained between Eritreans. That would have made, if it had been allowed to run loose, would have made a remarkable state in Africa, not without its mistakes. You see, Isaias, whenever I interviewed him, he was appalled at the idea of the cult of personality. And so he was very anxious not to be Mao. And he, even now, he lives fairly anonymously in Asmara, I believe. You know, he has no great palazzos. And he certainly didn't in 2000. And people could bring, if they dared, complaints to his door. And all that is wonderful. But it has gone, it's soured. His opposition to the cult of personality cramped the style of a lot of other Eritreans and well, has obviously cramped the development of Eritrea. So it's just another place that contributes people in the refugee base landing on that island off Italy.
Lampedusa.
Lampedusa. Named by the way of a great Italian novelist. But to be reduced from the high state of what you were, even though your life was threatened, to what you are now, mere knockers on the door of Western Europe. One can see why it's happening, but it's tragic. It's not the result that the Eritreans wanted as a group.
Well, it's a somber history, of course. And as you said, initially it seemed as if the country was on a positive trajectory, but over time it has really spiraled downward. If Fred Hollow's
and
yeah.
You see, I heard first that Isaias was putting an embargo on journalists. The idea was national unity was everything. So the normal freedom of the press, which attended the creation of the state, couldn't be allowed. And journalists are a pain in the butt, and it's their place to be a pain in the butt. And their criticism is obviously often gratuitous, at least in the view of those they criticize. But ultimately, it's good to have a free press. Ultimately, it's good, even though your enemy will use it. It's very easy to repress the press, but once you do that, the next steps along the way become easier. And the next non-fraternal step, like making the Eritreans serve extended military terms, because it's a dangerous period in their development and where we need the state to survive. God knows such a cost was paid for it. So again, you've got, okay, longer terms in the military, the journalists in jail, but we know why. But then it goes on to other intrusions upon personal liberty.
It becomes excessive.
And it was the Eritrean, if it was a fall, and the West considers it a fall, even though they never look at their own damn falls, it seemed to be a fall by little and little, by understandable intrusions, followed by more gratuitous ones. The multi-party state could not be permitted because of this issue of Christianity and Islam. And political parties would try other things too. They would cater to special interests. When the Eritreans had triumphed with nothing, no one in their corner, nothing to their name, they had triumphed over a very sophisticated administration in Ethiopia, a country that could be sophisticated if only the emperor and Mengistu had wanted it to be, but they didn't. And therefore, you know, it is a great tragedy, but tragedies are lifelong. History deals with epochs, and the Eritrean epoch is coming. And we know it every time I meet someone, even you. You've got it in you because it's just part of your culture, the culture you were raised with. Okay, the people before you no doubt hammered into your brain how hard it was. I can say that the hardness of Eritrean life and its peril, the peril of what was unbearable and could only be borne because of these trucks bringing aid in. They needed that aid and they got it nearly all to the people. And I was impressed that one night in Eritrea, when my wife was with me, we left a rota and we ran into Hadarib nomads, camels on. They had a girl of about 15 who had trodden on a landmine sometime earlier. And they were taking her to a rota. And her legs were all smashed about. And what interested me is the nomads could bring their daughter into a rota and know she would be treated. In a supposedly sophisticated Australia, could a tribal elder bring his daughter into a Western hospital and be sure she'd be treated as well as others? Not till modern times did that happen. The Eritreans did it. They made the span between the emperor and the modern world. Individual entitlement to health, universal, even to the nomads. And then somewhere out west anyhow, in the foothills on the other side, on the Sudanese side, I saw the distribution of food to a nomad group once. We slept in the riverbank with the nomads and were woken at about 5 in the morning by the pounding of coffee. And the nomads had a food distribution early that morning before the distribution place became too hot. And it happened under canvas in the edge of the forest where the distribution couldn't be seen by aircraft and all the rest of it. It is your forebears survived without any encouragement. And I can tell because they've indoctrinated you that you wouldn't have, you would have survived. If you were put in that situation, you'd find reserves you don't think are in you. It's very tough being a child in your situation in which you were a child, because your parents want the best for you, but they also tell you the barbarity that you came from, how imperiled they were, how imperiled, therefore, your existence was. And believe me, in telling how imperiled your existence was and their existence, you can't exaggerate. There was nothing in the landscape to encourage what was happening. And the fact that the Eritreans ran a congress in this, a congress of their own within the Eritrean area, and that one day I was with a guide, also called Fessehaie, long may he live. He was an Eritrean diplomat in Cairo. I'm not sure where he is now, but we were walking one morning when our truck broke down, and he said, there's a bunker near here, and a friend of mine who's a member of Congress is here. And so I don't know how he knew, but we walked over to this featureless hill and into a cave, and a member of Congress who later was in the ruling group and whose name I've forgotten, was nursing a baby there in a bunker while going around the country as a member of Congress. And she was an old fighter, a former fighter. And this baby I met in 2000, was 13, very Western, lives in Asmara. These people, I'm not talking about her, I'm talking about the Eritrean people. These Eritrean people have paid too much not to succeed. They've paid, the world has done their best to obliterate them as a superfluous people who kept on asserting on their self-governance over Ethiopia. And that was inconvenient for everyone. And now they still have their independence. And it's time that, one hopes that for your children, there'll be a new Eritrea, because Asaias, who was a remarkable man and a remarkable general, that's the other thing. There was no cult of generals in the EPLF. Go to any other group and you go to an area occupied recently by the rebels, and the poster of the general would be on every telegraph pole and on every bit of stick. None of that for Asaias. It was astounding that these great victories happened. Afarbek was captured, Massawa was captured, and the top of the news was nothing to do with generals. It was always the EPLF had done this. And that was admirable, because he was not going to get into the cult of personality. And as far as I know, he hasn't. But the cost at which he's maintained the non-cult has been too high. And
it's fed the repression of the country, don't you say?
Yes, that's right. And the Eritreans, as all the Eritreans you meet in New York and Washington, and I've lived in America because I used to live in New York and taught at New York University. And you see in them, it's there. And you meet them, particularly, I don't know if the Eritreans and Ethiopians still do that. They do front of hotel parking, front of institute parking. There are many Eritrean taxi drivers, the most educated taxi drivers on earth. And I have got into cabs in Washington where the Eritrean has not accepted the fare. Blows you away, and I suffered nothing. I mean, Eritrea scared the bejesus out of me. as an individual, but my scare was never that of living permanently there and looking to starvation on a daily diet, on a daily basis, and looking to the brutality of another army on a daily basis. And yes, I still think if I'd written a better book, maybe everyone would have read it. And it would have become essential even for Republicans to do something about Eritrea. And it was easier to get the Democrats interested, I've got to say, because, whatever the cause.
Perhaps in closing, I'll ask this just to kind of summarize your reflection and your experience and contrast it to what we have now. You know, if the Eritrean soldiers who died could see the situation now, if Fred Hollows were still alive, as you alluded to, if they could see the degradation that the country has gone into, what do you think they would say? How would they perceive the situation in the country?
Well, Fred would say, I'm going to go and talk to them. And he would have talked to them. He would have given them hell. But ultimately, he's an outsider. But he would not, he would be campaigning for liberal representative democracy, not because it's the answer to everything, but because it's the answer to many things. And he would, it is wonderful to live in a country like Australia, where a bloke gets defeated in an election and he immediately leaves office. He doesn't call up the Australian Army. He doesn't call up the Air Force. He just goes. He goes back to his suburban house. That's the sort of wonderful thing that representative democracy can give you. An untroublesome passage of power. And ultimately, it's not a surprise to me that Trump is saying the election was stolen, because it's the way to do away with that passage of power. He wants power given back to him on a flawed basis. And thank God, every time a government falls here or in any of the liberal democracies of the world, the fellow or the woman goes off and says thank you, begins to collect his pension. And that is something that I look forward to happening in Eritrea. Because if you deal with representative democracies like the US, where a person is in power, too often representing lobbies, etc. But a man gets into power, and you see how strange he becomes over 4 years. Imagine how strange he becomes after 30 years. And Isaias has been there for 30 years. Without anyone contradicting, without anyone daring to contradict. No human is made for that. And yet many powerful humans think they're built that way, that they can do it, that they can be the uncorrupt leader. But everything is too subjective in them. And ultimately the subjective takes over, and subjective tyrannies take over. And that's why I spoke in honor of multiple parties and representative democracy. It's just that it doesn't do everything, but it does give people space to live co-defenders of yourself, so that if I were arrested this afternoon, all the people that live around me would be out and they'd be hitting the police with umbrellas. The police would at least think twice about whether this was a good thing. That's the sort of thing that happens in democracies and doesn't have terrible things happened, like the Black Lives Matter murders in America. Terrible things happen, like Republicans now in Texas trying to deny advice to illiterate African Americans in polling stations. Terrible things happen, yeah, but good things happen too. The only good things that happen to you in representative democracy happen to you because it's there. And so that's what I would hope for Eritrea, and that Eritrea would take the formula further. If you want, you can have, like they do in California, you can get a referendum on a democratic issue onto the federal poll, so that you can vote if it's got 250,000 signatures to support it. Therefore, you are not out of democracy, you are in it. And I think it's just that the economics of America, the belief that the market is everything and will be everything, has counted too many people out. And America's infrastructure is old, and you can't get a good university education without taking on a huge mortgage. Education should be in part, universities have to live, but it should be in part a birthright. And this seems very socialist to Americans, but it doesn't seem socialist to Australians. I remember meeting one day, I flew out to an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and two doctors on board approached me and said, we went to your hospital. It was a hospital where my father was head of, my brother rather was head of anesthesia. And they said, it's very socialistic. People can come in and just be treated. And to me, that's not socialistic. It's human to human. It's what humans do for each other. So I know, having seen the miracles that you presented, that you created in the field and did on your own. And one gift that Esaias gave us, that he believed in this capacity of the Eritreans to do it on its own. So that will, on their own. So that will remain. And one day it will make a remarkable social democracy in East Africa. So remarkable that there'll be people in the State Department who hate you.
Well, Tom, I'd like to give you
other reasons to hate you.
I'd like to give you the final word.
Well, look, if Eritreans ask me to do something, I generally do. I've only been to America with Fred Holloway's wife to receive the Fred Hollows Award. But I am not Fred Hollows was a wonderful revolutionary. You didn't have to wind him up. You didn't have to tell him what to do. He knew already. I'm the sort of fella you've got to tell what to do. Preferably a number of strong women have to say, you do this or you. I'm a good man for following the orders of strong women. So there's anything I can ever do for the Eritreans that is within my medical strength was fortunately fairly strong at the moment. And within my means, I would definitely think 3-4 times about the viability of doing it, even though we're in different continents, you and me. But I would happily be an American, warts and all, because the means of American redemption is within the citizens. And you see it happening. But our last election, we killed neoliberalism, the idea of trickle-down economics that didn't trickle down to the lower fifth of the population. And we have some going back to the old market-driven economy, but not everything in the world is a market issue. And that the Australians ultimately never swallowed that. And they've had a stomachful of trickle-down economics. And I hope the time comes when wise Eritreans make a great republic in the Horn of Africa, and America also wakes up to itself.
Tom, I'd like to thank you. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm very pleased to talk to you, George, and your face brings back Eritrean memories.